And what I don't want to be misunderstood to be saying is that we are in a literal time of crisis. And when I say literal, I mean prophetically. Ellen White says in a number of places that it is in a time of crisis that character is revealed. So, as I say, we're not in a prophetic time of crisis. Because most, if not all, of the statements that she uses this phrase in can be placed in a dispensation. And that dispensation is not the one we are currently in. But as we head toward this crisis, when people know that something important is about to happen, that a crisis is about to occur, or that their end is near, they tend to change their behavior. And what I've tried to do over the last 12 to 15 months is to begin to focus our attention on the coming crisis, the Sunday law. And I think in order for that to be done, we need to reconsider or reevaluate who we are and what we stand for. So this work has not begun or states. Did I lose connection?
Are you online? I can hear you. I can see you.
So I'm going to repeat what I said. This work of preparing for the coming crisis didn't begin at the IPR camp meetings. Although some people are using those meetings as a reference point. And last week, I spent some time in 2 presentations clarifying points that I had made earlier. As I said, this is a subject that I've been trying to discuss for over a year. And last week, I laid out certain phases of that work. And the gradual steps that I've taken to try to awaken our consciousness considering the time in which we're living and the future crisis ahead of us. and have approached this issue from varying perspectives. What my hope is that each of us, wherever we think that we are in this movement, whether we feel like as though we are full participants, or that we have been disenfranchised. So I'll explain disenfranchised. Some people may not know what the word means. It's people who think that they have been unfairly treated. Or misunderstood. And the term that's used in the world to describe that nowadays is cancel culture, or the idea that people aren't allowed to speak their minds. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that each of us or any of us can say anything we want to. We discussed this last week when I asked the question, or the question was posed, in fact, it was actually a statement, I believe. If we as a movement are now liberal and no longer conservative. And I try to show that we are as conservative as we have ever been. So I'm not suggesting that each of us are free or have the liberty to say what we want, any time that we want, how we want. What, when, how. But that needs to be balanced. It needs to be balanced with the idea, with the belief both corporately and individually that we're all part of something, that we are not leaving groups of people by the side. That individuals or groups of people in our movement do not feel that they have been ignored or rejected. Now, I know for a certainty there are some, perhaps more than we appreciate, perhaps more than we're honest about, that do feel disenfranchised, which I defined earlier. And what I want to do, both as a leader and as a member, in the closing moments of this dispensation, is to gather up the fragments to prepare for the coming crisis. And on the line of the 144,000, I believe we're all aware that there are two crises that follow back to back that are ahead of us. Prophetically, we call them the Sunday law and then the close of probation. And it seems to me that this is the opportune moment, really the final opportunity for us to begin this work of coming together, of putting away our differences and preparing for the coming crisis. So, besides a theological, doctrinal, and technical discussion, so I said doctrinal, theological, and technical, of course. Besides those issues, what I've tried to discuss in my presentations over the past 12 months is to give an opportunity for those who feel rejected or separated from us an opportunity for them to reevaluate their position, their thoughts and their feelings, and begin to take steps to be reintegrated into the movement. Some have already left bodily, physically. They're an important class of people. But there's a forgotten class. Those who have chosen not to leave. But deep down, do not feel part of the movement. And I've tried to express that in different ways. That they feel silenced. They feel that their legitimate concerns aren't addressed. That they can't question. I don't mean question core elements of the message. But there may be things that they disagree with. And whilst that group of people are not my only concern, I think it's time for them and the rest of us to begin to have a conversation personally, publicly, and in our classes to try to attempt reconciliation. It serves no one any good if people feel that they are not really a part of the movement, that they don't have an identity. And I want us to consider these things wherever we stand, wherever we are in relationship to this issue, positive or negative. And I want those members, whether they're individuals or whether they're a group, to lay down their weapons and begin to try to be reconciled. And that demands that the rest of us, those who feel part of this movement, that we have an obligation to try to create an environment in this movement that's willing to be more open to different ideas and to have open and honest conversations. In the past, whilst people may not have realized there was an undercurrent that nobody spoke about, which was about American entitlement. Can you hear me okay? I said about American entitlement, yes. So this idea was based upon inspiration, where America was identified as being central to end-time prophecy. It is, after all, the glorious land. Now, with that prophetic model, the leadership that was based in the United States felt a sense of entitlement to maintain control of the work. And that wasn't a problem until it began to be questioned. Now, that question wasn't just a theoretical one. It was not based upon discontent. Or rebellion, but let's call it providence. God, in their infinite wisdom, raised up people in the movement who were not from the glorious land. And over the decades, there have been many who have helped shape and mold and direct the message. But that began to be a problem when it was seen that they were beginning to take over leadership positions. We've all heard of the phrase, they must increase and I must decrease. And the reality of that was more painful than people imagined it could ever be. That was in a previous dispensation. And everybody here today accepts what happened and the consequences of what happened. But we entered into another crisis in our movement. This was not based upon geography, nor race, but it was based upon gender. Upon, if I can use this phrase, the role and responsibility of men and women in this movement. And I know that it's dangerous and no longer appropriate to use this this model. This bipolar model of humanity. But it's led to a problem within our movement. If you'll allow me to use this bipolar model for a little bit longer. That it's not people of color. It's not those from the glorious land that feel disenfranchised. It's men. Half of this movement do not feel as though they are equal partners. They feel as though they have been cancelled, silenced, unable to complain, unable to give their perspective, and basically left without a voice. Now, whilst this is important and serious, I do need to remind all these men that feel like this and I'm not saying it's every man, but this is the very experience that women have endured for millennia. But it's all too commonplace in the world, in the church, in culture and religion, because at the end of the day, there's really no difference between the two. No difference between the world and the church. No difference between culture and religion. A model that I've used frequently is that they're two sides of the same coin. And because we've all been indoctrinated, we've all grown up in this patriarchal framework, it seemed normal that men would lead, that their voices and opinions would be heard, that they would mold and shape the direction in which this prophetic movement would go. But as we have tried to become more egalitarian, many men in our movement don't view the change in that way. I think many of them believe we have become more sexist. And they will describe their experience, if they're brave enough, quietly, privately amongst friends and confidants, that they don't see equality because they see that their voices have been taken away. For those men, I'm not trying to say to them that this is retribution, this is payback. That this is women taking their revenge. Because I fear some of them view this change in that way. But it's not. This is women who have, from the beginning of time, suffered under the oppressive force of men, not just bad men. What's worse, that they have suffered under the rule of good men. And I think in many ways that's worse. I used the phrase in a previous presentation, the enemy within the gate, which is not a biblical term, because the biblical term or idea is that there's an enemy at the gate, an external force, which is what this movement was created to proclaim. That there is an enemy at the gate, and we need to come together to repel and resist it. But we cannot do that work until we deal with the enemy within. And of course, I use the term enemy not in a literal sense, not in a moral sense, but it's a play on words. Because if those people in our movement do not begin to see themselves as real, genuine, legitimate members of this movement, they won't join with the rest of us in resisting the external foe. Because there is one. We may not fully understand what it looks like. We may not understand what it means to resist this external force. Maybe there's still much for us to learn and unlearn. But the great controversy is still intact. The core principles on which it's founded are still true. And therefore, not just today, but over the last 12 months and longer, I've been appealing to this movement to get its house in order. And that's not just understanding the theological events that are happening all around us. I'm not negating the need to study what's happening in the world. But if we're not careful, this work can, in and of itself, become a distraction. Because there are people in our movement that are hurting. And that hurt is on different levels. But I think the core issue is that these people, the vast majority of whom are men, feel that they have been put to one side, sidelined, and that they no longer have a functioning voice amongst us. They may disagree with some of the finer points that we believe and teach. There may be some things that they don't understand why we emphasize. They may disagree with some of the things that we speak of. Whilst I am not in any way challenging or questioning the midnight cry message, and the studies upon which that message was built, and more importantly, the methodology upon which it was constructed, maybe some of the questions that these people have maybe they're correct to ask these questions. Maybe their views have some legitimacy. Maybe there are things we need to correct, or at least explain in a better way. So these are some of the thoughts and ideas that have been in my mind as we approach the Sunday law, as we are about to crash onto the beach. I use this term we collectively. We, the world. As we do that, and we see the nearness of the time, surely it behooves us, it's our responsibility as much as lies in our power to search out the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And in this context, the house of Israel is this movement, the stone. As individuals, as fellowships, as ministries, and as leaders, I think it's our responsibility collectively to create a space before the crisis comes upon us and it's too late, to give an opportunity for dialogue, that misunderstandings, that hurt feelings can be discussed and hopefully overcome, so that we can have a sufficient level of unity upon which to move forward. So this is a short summary of what I've been trying to do over the past 12 months, when I have spoken, or when I began to speak about the subject of the Levites and then developed our thinking. When I've spoken at length about what it means to be a teacher in this movement. I got asked a question recently. It's a term that's used in the world, and depending on which part of the world you live, it could be phrased differently. So in English, the phrase is called the following. It's called inclusive writing. And as you can see from the title, just picking the word inclusive means to include people, which means not to exclude people. The question that was asked, is this a concept or an idea that we should adopt or embrace within our movement? And if you have heard of the term before and done some research, you'll have an opinion. If you haven't heard of the term before, I'm sure you'll look it up now. But the simple answer is, I believe yes. Now, inclusive writing covers many, many things. In fact, it's so expansive that everybody would have their own varying or differing views on what would be inclusive writing and what would not be. But simply put, I think it's good, both in our written form and spoken form, to use the core concepts of inclusive writing as much as possible. Because as the title indicates, what we want to do when we speak about people is to include them, value them, so they do not feel as though they are different. So I'm sure that after having heard this term, some of you will begin to research this, and perhaps someone might do a study on it, because it's all about including people rather than excluding them. And it's about communicating with one another based upon our shared humanity. And as I spoke earlier, I think it helps people to feel part of something. Which means people will feel empowered rather than being set aside, disenfranchised, or another word that's often used is marginalized, which means obviously to be put on the margins or on the edge of something. So I think it would be a good exercise, to whatever degree that you're able to or willing to look at inclusive writing and begin to have some self-examination. To take out gender biases from your words and your thoughts. to not speak of people in reference to their what they look like or descriptions of their appearance. Some time ago now, I mentioned in a presentation that I had a problem with women who had short hair. Now, when I made that statement, which was in the first person, not third person, I personified it to myself, as I often do. The vast majority of people understood what I was saying. That I wasn't speaking about myself, but I was speaking on behalf of other people or other groups in our movement. Now, as we've spoken about inclusive language, I want to remind us there's a difference between the words that we speak and the actions that we take, and our thoughts and motivations. So the ideal situation is that those two things, the inner thoughts and the external actions, match. But that's a process. You will know that you're not allowed to abuse people. Everybody knows that that is the right thing. They believe that. I say everybody, I mean in the movement. But there are still adults amongst us who abuse others. There are still men abusing women. And there are still parents abusing their children. So even though there may not be a desire as a parent to abuse your child, parents still do that. There's a disconnect between the belief system and the action. This is all to do with the studies related to the nature of humanity. Our construction, if you like. And I've tried to describe this in various ways. So one that I focused on extensively was the fast brain and the slow brain. And I think I've spoken about that so often, most of us understand the concepts, at least to a degree. And many of us have read books on it. So the ideal situation is that our inner thoughts, our feelings match our behavior. Now, sometimes our beliefs are correct, but our behavior is wrong. That's not good. But it's a reality of our humanity. Sometimes our behavior is good, but our thoughts and our feelings are not. You can restrain yourself because you're worried about the consequences of bad behavior. In English, they use the term, but you bite your tongue. And you've all seen the emoji that has a zip over the mouth, which means that you want to say something, but you're forcing your mouth shut. So an example of that was back in 2019. For one day, for one Sabbath, the women in this movement were told to wear pants or trousers. And the question that came back is, what if they don't believe in it? What should they do then? Because it became a test question. My response was, even if you disagree with it, the fact that you follow the rules or the command on that day, you would pass the test. And no one knows what that would mean for the future. But there was a test to be taken that day. So we're speaking about inclusive writing because that's the question that was asked. We've spoken about the differences of inner thoughts and external actions. And how they can differ. And I've spoken about the parable that I gave about a man not liking a woman's appearance. And it was in the context of short hair. So a number of people contacted me afterwards. And they were wondering if I was speaking about myself. Because they felt surprised that I would openly speak about my dislike of short hair. So they had not understood the exercise I was trying to take us through. And one of the thoughts that came up in that discussion that I had with those several people was that whilst it was legitimate, whilst it was okay, whilst I had a right as an individual man, to have an opinion upon the likes and dislikes that I would have about a woman's appearance. The example was long hair or short hair. I was told, whilst it's legitimate to have those opinions, because I'm free to, what they felt I didn't have a right to do, or what I shouldn't have done as a leading figure, is to express my opinion in the way that I had. And what I found the most interesting thing and the most concerning thing was not that I had been misunderstood, that they didn't see that this was a parable, that I wasn't speaking about my opinions, but about others. That to make a point, I identified as them, with them, those men who have an opinion. So what I found most worrying, and maybe you will disagree with what I'm about to say, but for me, it comes down to this idea of inclusive language. Because inclusive language is good. But I think what's more important is to have inclusive thoughts. That our thinking is inclusive. Not just our words, our language. And I'm of the opinion, and this is not a parable, this is me, so you're welcome to disagree. And I'll use this again in a damaged framework. As a man speaking about women, I don't believe that I even have a right to have an opinion about a woman's hair. I use the word opinion. I don't think I have a legitimate, I don't think it's legitimate for me to have a personal preference. Because what ends up happening is that I end up marginalizing women based upon their looks. And I think that's, for me, fundamentally wrong. I think it's fundamentally correct for an individual, for a woman, to have a preference, to have a choice about her own look, upon her own appearance. So she can choose for herself how she looks, what she prefers, but as an outsider, third person, I don't think I have a legitimate right to have a preference. I think my response should be, if she prefers to look that way, then not only is that her right, then that's good for her. And I can't say whatever I think, because the ideal situation to be in is that I don't judge a person, a woman, on her appearance, which means I don't have a preference. Now, I know there are people who are going to disagree. They're going to argue that people have a preference based upon appearance, based upon attraction. But I'm not focusing upon that aspect of our humanity. Because when we do, when we speak about people that we're sexually attracted to based upon their appearance, I think if we're not careful, we end up falling into a ditch. So I've collected some various thoughts and packaged them together into this question, which is about being inclusive, not only in our language, but in our thoughts. Wherever you stand, wherever you are in this movement, whether you're one of the people who do judge on people's appearance, that you've told people that you prefer them a certain way, which means that you desire to mold them in your image according to your preferences, I'd ask you to stop and consider their humanity, not your preferences. All of these thoughts, all of these ideas are all interconnected. And the connection is that we need to come together and to attempt to stop focusing upon our differences and not only see our shared humanity, but also to realize that prophetically we are together, that we're not some random individuals, we're the 144,000 who are required to march in step to view things the same way, to have a common identity, mission, and perspective of the truth. If you feel that you've been misunderstood, mistreated, rejected, if you feel that you may have done that to somebody, individually and collectively, interpersonally and organizationally, seems to me that this is the last opportunity that we have of seeking for the lost sheep and bringing them back into the fold. Some may make it back on their own, but the vast majority need to be searched out and healed. This is not license to ignore the truth, to pretend that there are no rights and wrongs, that we're free to believe what we want. But this is an opportunity for each of us to question our individual and corporate place in prophecy. We have been spared the burden, the responsibility of taking care of others. We have been spared the responsibility of having to take care of others. Because we have an opportunity now to take care of ourselves and to prepare for the coming crisis. Let's pray. Dear Lord, as we open this weekend camp meeting, as it takes its place in prophetic history, as together we explore the truths that you want us to understand, that will be brought to view during these coming presentations, I thank you for myself and behalf of all those in the movement for being allowed to be a part of this great prophetic movement, not only corporately, but as an individual, that you have given me a glimpse, that you have given each of us a glimpse into your divinity and what it means to be a living God, one who takes responsibility for their behavior and their actions. That when things go wrong, when you're accused of bad behavior, you don't shy away, you don't run away, but you face your responsibilities. It's my prayer, and I hope the prayer of everybody here, and through the coming meetings, that we will enter into and share that part of your divinity, and we can live as your counterparts. In Jesus' name. Amen.
Muy bien, agradecemos al anciano Parminder por este